Hello, and welcome to the Indian Ocean World podcast. My name is Sam Gleave Riemann, and I am a research assistant at the Indian Ocean World Center at McGill University and producer of this program. Today, I am thrilled to be in conversation with Dr. Nienke Boer, who holds a lectureship in world literatures in English at the University of Sydney. Dr. Boer's research interests include slavery, the law, and literature around the Indian Ocean world, working through both post-colonial and environmental humanities lenses. On this episode, we will be discussing her incredible and wide-ranging first monograph, The Briny South, Displacement and Sentiment in the Indian Ocean World, which was published last year, that is, in 2023, by Duke University Press. Nienke, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Sam, for having me.
We're very excited to have you here. We usually like to start out just by asking for, an overview of whatever work it is we're reviewing. But today, I wanted to start by asking you about the title of this book. The Briny South is such a key term through the whole work. And I'm just wondering, how could you define that? What is the Briny South? And importantly, what disciplines or concepts do you rely on to develop this term? Or how does this term help you to discuss the history and methods you explore in the book?
Thank you, Sam. So the Briny South is the sort of field or paradigm that I locate at the intersection of ocean studies and global South studies. Sort of drawing on the strengths of both of these fields. So these are both fields that have emerged as a way to deal with sort of a increasing awareness of transnational histories, worlds beyond like the national frame of analysis, way to get at sort of those larger global flows. So just drawing on the strengths of both of those things, those fields, drawing from global South studies, the sort of focus on subaltern figures and solidarity amongst those links between those subaltern figures, while from ocean studies, drawing the focus on deep time, longer durations, and environmental concerns. So I define the Briny South as a way of looking at the role of the ocean in perpetuating forms of oppression and exploitation, looking at oceanic lines of subaltern connection, solidarity, and shared resistance. So what that allowed me to do was turn to these sort of three groups of actors that I'm looking at in the book, which are enslaved persons, indentured laborers, and war prisoners traveling across the Indian Ocean, and bring together those sort of histories under the framework of the Briny South.
That's such a fantastic answer. I wonder if we can then just carry on about those three different groups. So apart from forced migration across the Indian Ocean to or from Southern Africa, how and why did you link these three groups from a thematic standpoint?
Yes, so I was interested in looking at, or inspired by the work done on the Atlantic Ocean, and specifically the Black Atlantic. So I wanted to do something similar for the Indian Ocean world in finding a framework that would allow me to discuss different forms of racialization across time and specifically across empires. So bringing together these three forms of displacement. Enslavement started under the Dutch Empire, the Dutch East India Company, of course, and then was carried on by the British, who also brought indentured laborers to South Africa from South Asia. And then the war prisoners I look at are South African war prisoners displaced during the Second South African or the Anglo-Boer War, as it's known, to camps in India. So the idea was to look at both sort of breaks and continuities between those forms of displacement and look at things that only emerge, that only become clear when you put those forms together, when they're usually studied separately.
I wonder if we can speak a little bit more on that then, because all three of these groups do have this connection with Southern Africa. And I wonder how you consider how, this focus on Southern Africa, or South Africa in particular, pushes the boundaries of the Indian Ocean world. Until recently, South Africa has rarely been considered part of this Indian Ocean world, or at least this applies to the most influential textbooks that were written in the 1980s to the early 2000s. Thus, what is the importance of South Africa or Southern Africa more broadly to the Indian Ocean world? And how does an Indian Ocean world perspectives help to illuminate Southern African history and literature in this period that you're considering?
Yeah, so South Africa was not considered, or has traditionally not been considered part of that Indian Ocean world because it's not part of that monsoon trading patterns. But I argue that it should be very central to the Indian Ocean world because it was central to the Dutch Empire, the Dutch East India Company world of networks in the Indian Ocean world, which is incredibly important in the 17th and 18th century in the Indian Ocean, but is often overshadowed by sort of 19th century British imperial territory within the Indian Ocean. So one argument for including South Africa in the Indian Ocean world then is that sort of centrality of those nodes between Batavia and the Cape and the other parts of the Indian Ocean world that were connected by the Dutch East India Company. But also in terms of South African history, if you think about it, because of these connections, because the Dutch East India Company was entirely Indian Ocean based and South Africa was part of that world rather than the Dutch West India Company. The South African history, imperial history, is very much an Indian Ocean history, even if one often thinks of it as part of the Atlantic world. So through these, especially these forms of displacement, enslavement, and indenture, South Africa was very much implicated in that Indian Ocean world and sort of entangled with those connections within the Indian Ocean world as individuals came from South Asia, Southeast Asia, the East African coast, and also via Mauritius. So those kind of links and networks are incredibly important to understanding the history of South Africa in sort of a more transnational framework.
Yeah, this was something that I really appreciated about the book of situating South Africa in the Indian Ocean world, and also as this entry point for so many Europeans traveling into it, the empire building in the Indian Ocean. Very, very interesting. I wonder then if we can talk a little bit about the sources, because one of the other things that I loved talking about the differences between Atlantic and Indian Ocean slaveries is that the sources are so different, and the literary remnants of the slave trade in both regions are so different. So from these 18th century legal texts that you weave together with novels written and published in the 20th century, how do you contend with this wonderful interdisciplinary range that informs the book? How did you select the sources you consulted? And what sort of training do you draw on to engage with this book's diverse source material?
So this book took like a really long time to write. I don't even want to add together the number of years that I've been working on it. And that is partly because I had to master all of these different periods and skills. So sort of my training originally was in law and literature and post-colonial studies. And the project itself started as my PhD dissertation. So I don't know, there's probably graduate students who listen to this podcast. Like, you have so much more time while you're doing that for these kinds of explorations. Like, I really think one should think about that period of being a graduate student as, one of like training and having time to explore these different things. So that allowed me to visit a lot of the archives that I use in the book, and also time for language studies. So I came into the PhD program having lived in India for a year and having some foundation in Hindi, which I was able to then further while I was a graduate student. Also, thankfully came in with Dutch and of course English reading skills. So that's another thing that you need to work on is those languages. So basically that, was the foundation for some of the like archival research that I did for the book. And my sort of training in law and literature and post-colonial studies allowed me to deal with a lot of those sort of like the 19th century sources onwards. So when, after finishing the PhD, I wanted to expand it to add those archives of enslavement, so the 18th century Dutch archives, that I realized that I really needed like a whole different skill set for that. And I should also say that archival study in itself is something that you just need to, time to figure out for yourself. Because I was talking to some historian friends of mine, and they were like, yeah, we don't get any training either. You just kind of have to like go into the archives and figure it out for yourselves, and just spend a lot of time and miss things and have to go back. And it's just a time-consuming process. So yeah, when those 18th century records were like a whole new world to me, and I realized that I needed help with that. So I joined there was a small 18th century study group in Singapore, where I was based at the time. So I was part of that for 3 or 4 years, and I would attend their meetings, listen to their papers. They workshop my chapter on the 18th century material, because I really wanted it to be legible. Even if an 18th century scholar picked up just that one chapter, I didn't want them to be like, "Ugh, dilettante," So that was something that was really important to me, to like master that sort of field as well. And then I've just been attending conferences on legal history, on enslavement, on the Indian Ocean world, even on Victorian studies, right? And sort of presenting parts of this material to get feedback from those different fields, to make sure that people feel that this is a valid argument and that I'm not missing anything enormous. So yeah, basically it's just time. I think that's the key for something like this. And I'm not sure if I would recommend tackling such a broad spectrum to anyone, but it was very enriching an experience for me.
Yeah, I know when we were talking about the book around the office, we were saying, well, each one of these chapters could well be a monograph on its own, that they're so rich, they're so dense. But I really do appreciate the diachronic nature of your analysis, and how, as you put it, you're not just going from discipline to discipline, you're going from time period to time period, and having to engage with all the scholarly conversations in those eras as well. But this is something that a lot of Indian Ocean world and a lot of oceanic studies has in common. From Brodel on, we've been tied up with these longue durée forms of history. What advantages do you see in that longue durée approach, especially in this book? Was there something in particular that, crossing these 3 centuries of histories really allowed you to explore in depth? And yeah, curious about this.
These 3 different forms of displacement have been studied, both sort of by South Africanists and internationally, but putting them together in this way allowed certain sort of links that otherwise, when you do sort of study them separately or study them in different sort of disciplines that remain invisible, putting them together as this kind of sort of form of minor transnationalism allows these unexpected links to emerge, and specifically in the forms of racial subjectification and control, right? The way that even though these different empires and sort of forms of post-imperial racial control, even though they have different sort of legal systems in place, they're drawing from each other. So the Dutch legal system that's put into place at the Cape is picked up on and built on by the British when they take over in the 19th century. And then the apartheid regime, of course, is drawing on both of those kind of legal histories in order to form their kind of forms of legal control and laws. So, and you only see those links when you look at these forms, and specifically the role that all 3 of these different forms of racialized control, the use that they make of sentiment, right, in describing and racializing the subjects that they're attempting to control. So I like to think of this as both providing a sort of transnational history of apartheid, longer more in-depth history of apartheid that doesn't start in 1948 or even in the 20th century, but that really looks at the deep histories. But then also thinking about how these kind of forms of racialization and racial control are the basis of contemporary forms of inequalities across the globe. And so how this is a case study helps us understand there's other forms of global inequalities as well.
Yeah, and I want to ask a little bit more about sentiment in a second, but first, could we just talk, while we're on the subject of race, could we talk about whiteness in this book? Mm-hmm. Because that's the question that I have here about race, is I find it so interesting how you explore the development of whiteness in the South African and Indian Ocean world context in this sort of longue durée way, from these insipid abolitionist writings in the 19th century to impassioned Afrikaner narratives in the early 20th century. How do you see whiteness activated in these cases and others that you explore? What role does sentiment, again, coming back to this term, play in activating this identity? And, even in this post-apartheid era, do you see contemporary resonances?
I can expand a bit more on my definition and how I got to this idea of sentiment in a bit. But fundamentally, sentiment, my argument comes down to the idea that sentiment, and by sentiment, I mean the depiction of emotions, right? The way that emotions are represented on the page rather than the emotions themselves, that this form of control of the way that sentiment is described functions essentially as a weapon of the powerful. It does not function very effectively as a weapon of resistance by the subaltern. And so it becomes intertwined as this category of whiteness as a form of power emerges. Control of sentiment becomes intertwined with that. So even, very interestingly, in two of the chapters, I actually look at writings by M.K. Gandhi, right? And he was in a relatively privileged position in South Africa. He was working as a lawyer. He was not one of the indentured laborers that I'm looking at. But even when he's trying to write about the indentured laborers, he's stuck in this bind where he cannot activate sentiment in the same way that the powerful can, while maintaining his position as a speaking subject. Is excluded from using sentiment in the way that white abolitionists, for example, could use it to write about the enslaved. And the same, sort of interestingly, when we think about the South African prisoners of war taken to India, of course, they're almost all white. And at that moment, while they're being transported, they are in a position of relative powerlessness, right? They're under the control of the British. But this very powerlessness, this very suffering of the prisoners of war becomes eventually activated as a form of sentiment and becomes one of the greatest weapons in apartheid writers' arsenal, is activating this kind of earlier suffering of the war prisoners. So all of which is to say that certainly, there's something there about who can deploy what I'm calling the weapon of sentiment, right? And that is very much racialized and is very much sort of a weapon that is successfully used only by white individuals writing. So to think about sort of contemporary resonances, I'm trying not get too much into contemporary analysis, but if you think about this weaponized rhetoric of whiteness and suffering, right? You can see this across the globe in various places. In South Africa, of course, in the States, and even in Australia, where there was recently a failed referendum on a sort of voice to parliament, that this weapon of white suffering and sentiment is activated in all these different spaces in the rhetoric that's used. Yeah, and of course, the language of sentiment is employed by racialized individuals, and word sentiment itself just pops up all over the place. I think that's a great answer, actually, to both of the questions that I had there, one on sentiment and on whiteness.
I wonder then if we could turn to the end of the book. And if we're going to be talking about contemporary resonances, you end the book in the 21st century talking about the ongoing Chagossian exile, right in the middle of the Indian Ocean world, where the rest of the book has been ping-ponging from one side of it to the other. You rightly identified this exile as a recent example of the same displacements that you have identified in the past. Where does the island Indian Ocean world fit in your analysis as a whole? Do small islands or the ocean itself become more prominent as time goes on and as empires change? And my cheeky phrasing it is, in other words, does the briny South get brinier?
Yeah, so islands certainly, function as some of the last bastions of imperial power. You have, scattered across all of the oceans, these little islands that people don't even think about anymore that are still being held by mostly European powers, right? So, and that's something that should not be ignored or neglected because those little small nodes are still really important in how contemporary sort of biopolitical power is exerted across the globe. Thinking again of, the Chagos, for example, as sort of a black site for CIA operations. But more importantly, perhaps, is that, thinking about the sort of disproportionate impact of climate change on islands and how the marginalized living in these small island nations are becoming increasingly so. So thinking about these as sort of new forms of briny South oppression, right? In which, it's literally enacted by the ocean through sort of rising sea levels. So the ocean there becomes, sort of an involuntary actor in these forms of displacement and oppression. But that this climate change, of course, is caused and exacerbated and not like nothing is done about it exactly by the sort of the forms of capital that stem directly from these earlier imperial formations that I talk about in the book, right? So that you still have this global South, global North divide, which of course does not, not talking about geographic Norths and Souths, but, where power is held and that is disproportionately impacting these small oceanic islands. So I think it's very much a case of a continued, both new and continued form of sort of briny South oppression.
Can I press you a little bit more on the ocean itself? Where is the ocean itself situated here? Obviously it doesn't have a permanent population, but do you see it somewhere in the mix here?
Yeah, I was invested in sort of trying to think about like the ocean as an actor throughout these texts, even as my focus was on the people crossing the ocean. I really didn't want to lose sight of, and this is one of the strengths of ocean studies, of the ocean itself. So just thinking about how the traces of oceanic impression linger in the lives of these people who were displaced across the ocean. Like how, whether one is indentured and, seeks to return across the ocean, or you're trying to sort of escape that ocean and become a settler in whatever new colony, in this case South Africa, that you end up, still sort of haunted by that oceanic crossing, right? And that's true for the enslaved persons I look at as well. That this sort of like oceanic history is inscribed upon them in some form, and you see that in some of the. I feel like novelists can do this sort of more beautifully than I can. But something like Yvette Christians's Unconfessed, in which she has this passage where she talks about the sounds of the ocean sort of staying with an enslaved person and sort of like affecting her interaction with the land as well. So yeah, I think that was something that I tried to keep in mind in the background of all of these chapters, even as, honestly, it's quite dry, the analysis that I do, not dry in the sense of boring, but dry in the sense of landbound, as I'm looking at, court cases, legal documents, etc., that are very much invested in written on and like based on land.
Yeah, certainly never boring. Never boring. Yeah, this is a wonderful, wonderful read, and I really do appreciate how you and a lot of the literary works that you work with can contend with the ocean as both a barrier and a zone of transit, right? That duality that is so difficult sometimes in straight history to get across. Well, we've reached the end of the book, and if we just want to finish up here by asking our usual final question, what are you working on now? This was a long journey for you. What can we expect to see next, if anything?
Yeah, so while I was doing this research, this kind of archival research and delving into these histories and documents of imperial control, noticed that contemporary authors were doing the same thing. They were also looking at these archives and these subaltern figures, enslaved persons, indentured laborers, prisoners of war, but also soldiers, convicts, other forms of displacement. And writing historical fiction about them in a way that, I think sort of like really reactivates those archival documents and those subaltern figures in a more realist way than some of the sort of historiographic metafiction that we were seeing in the 90s, 80s, 90s, even early 2000s. And of course, listeners who are familiar with the Indian Ocean world will know Amitabh Ghosh's Ibis trilogy. And I think of the Ibis trilogy and Sea of Poppies as really sort of setting into motion this new genre, which I'm calling the Global South novel, right? These are sort of realist historical fiction that engage specifically with transnational subaltern protagonists, so sort of connecting different parts of the globe through these protagonists, which, are not like the earlier figures of white explorers or like military leaders or anything that we were seeing in historical fiction, but really thinking about sort of this history from below. So it's an analysis of how some 21st century authors represent the large-scale challenges of our time, so globalization and climate change specifically, through turning to these sort of unusual protagonists of transnational subaltern figures. And I hope that this will be of interest to all of those working in the global literature space, however you want to define that, teaching, researching, thinking about how to teach global literature. So as I argue for the value of shifting from post-colonial studies or world literature to actually thinking about global South literature and what that allows us to see that these other fields are perhaps foreclosing.
Yeah, and us at the IWC, we are all historians, and we loved this book. So if this is a sequel to Briny South, then it will be appreciated by people beyond literary studies as well, I'm sure. Nienke, thank you so much again for coming on the show. I also just want to thank the listener for downloading the podcast. Once again, my name is Sam Gleave Riemann, and that you have been listening to the Indian Ocean World podcast.
We would like to acknowledge the generous support of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. The Indian Ocean World podcast is produced under the SSHRC-funded Partnership, Appraising Risk, past and present. The podcast runs in conjunction with the annual speaker series at the Indian Ocean World Centre at McGill University, Montreal.